Don't come inside. You don't belong here anymore. Those were the first words my son said to me that night. Not hello, not Merry Christmas, not even the polite courtesy you give a stranger at the door. Just that. Cold, final. Words sharp enough to cut deeper than any blade. I stood in the doorway, the wind biting at my back, watching him block the light of the home I had once built with my own 2 hands. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. This was my son, the boy whose hand I used to guide across the street, the boy I had stayed awake for when he burned with fever, the boy I worked double shifts to feed. Yet his eyes, once so full of trust, now looked at me like I was an intruder.
You shouldn't be involved, he added, lowering his voice so his guests inside wouldn't hear. This isn't your place. You've had your time. Stay out of this.
Each word landed like a hammer against the chest. I wanted to speak, to tell him that blood doesn't expire, that fathers don't stop being fathers when their children grow. But the hallway behind him buzzed with laughter, voices of men I didn't recognize, investors, partners, outsiders who now had seats at his table while I stood at the threshold, unwanted. My hand hovered at the frame of the door, but I didn't step inside. The weight of his dismissal pressed me back. I could smell the food, hear the clink of glasses, the easy confidence in the room that used to be mine. And yet I was shut out, my own name erased. In his face I saw no hesitation, only resolve, the kind born of pride mixed with fear. He didn't want me near because my presence reminded him of something he was trying to bury. The foundation he stood on was mine, and to admit that would mean acknowledging he hadn't built it alone. So I stood in the cold, staring at my son, who was no longer my son, a door between us, and a silence heavier than words. He didn't slam it. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was worse than any sound of wood against wood. It was the look of a man who had chosen ambition over blood. And in that moment, I understood something bitter. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the ones who share your name. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever gone through something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. By doing so, you help us grow this channel and bring more stories like this to you. And now, let's continue. I did not argue with him. My voice remained locked behind clenched teeth, though every fiber of me screamed to cry out, to demand why, but I knew that no words could pierce through the armor of pride that now covered my son. Silence, I learned that night, can wound more than the loudest quarrel. His silence toward me was the death sentence of my belonging, and my silence in response was the surrender of a father who refused to beg. I stood on the threshold while strangers streamed past me into the house. They carried their laughter with them, their polished shoes leaving marks on the welcome mat I had nailed down years ago with my own hands. I had chosen that mat when he was just a boy, hoping it would be the first thing he saw when he brought his friends home from school. Now it lay beneath the feet of men who looked at me with indifference, as if I were a passerby in the wrong doorway. They crossed into the warmth without hesitation, while the cold air clung to me like a second skin. Through the narrow opening of the door, I could see the familiar glow of the living room. Once that room had been our world, our Christmas mornings, our late-night card games, our laughter spilling across the old wooden floor. I remembered him running across it in socks, sliding until he fell into my arms. But tonight that same room belonged to others. The chairs were filled with new voices, the table covered with papers and bottles instead of simple meals. The walls, once dressed in photographs of our family, now carried the polished emptiness of a showroom. The echoes of our life had been replaced by the shallow hum of business talk and hollow ambition. I could not help but recall the years I had spent holding this family together in silence. Nights when bills piled higher than food, when I came home long after midnight from shifts that chewed at my bones. I remembered patching the roof with frostbitten fingers, my breath rising in the darkness while rain lashed at my back, just so my son could sleep dry and safe. I remembered hiding my hunger so he could eat, pretending I had already eaten at work. Those sacrifices were not stories. They were scars written into my body. And yet none of that was visible to him now. To him, I was only a shadow lingering too long at the door. The betrayal was not in the words he had spoken. It was in the ease with which he let me stand outside, as if my presence embarrassed him. Betrayal, I realized, does not always roar. It sometimes whispers. It erases you so completely that you begin to doubt you ever belonged in the first place. My son had replaced me without even rage, without even hate. That would have been easier to bear. He replaced me with silence, with absence, with strangers who laughed in the house I had built. I turned slightly, my body refusing to leave, though my soul already felt exiled. Pride told me to walk away, to save what little dignity remained. But something deeper held me there, a desperate, unspoken question. Had he ever truly seen me? Or was I nothing more than a figure fading from the story of his life? The sound of clinking glasses burst through the hall, followed by the rise of laughter, the kind of laughter that swells when no one remembers the man left standing in the cold. It was louder than any insult, sharper than any rejection, and as it filled the night, I felt the first part of me break, not the kind of break that could heal, but the kind that leaves scars even time cannot smooth away. That night, betrayal did not shout. It whispered in silence, and it hurt all the more because it came from the only place where love should have been safe. They gathered around the table as if it had always been theirs. The scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers, the sudden burst of confident laughter, all of it sounded louder from the shadows of the hallway where I stood. Their voices carried the language of deals and promises, heavy with numbers and percentages, words spoken with the certainty of men who believed the future belonged only to them. My future, my sacrifices, my years, they were not even a footnote in their conversation. I leaned against the wall, half hidden by the dimness of the corridor, and for the first time in my own house, I felt like a trespasser. The walls that once echoed with the sound of my hammer, my tools, my hands shaping them into a home, now rejected me with silence. They carried the sound of strangers instead, men in pressed suits who had never touched a brick with bare fingers, never stayed awake at dawn wondering how to pay for food, sat where I once sat, their backs turned toward the door, as if I did not exist. The table itself was a wound. I had carved it when my son was still a child, the wood marked with faint scratches of birthdays, with stains from spilled soup and hurried breakfasts before school. It had been a place of family. Now it had been stripped bare, covered with neat stacks of contracts, documents, and shining bottles. It was no longer a table. It was a stage where I had been written out of the script. Their laughter swelled again, bouncing off the walls like echoes of betrayal. My son sat among them, leaning forward, his face lit with ambition. He gestured with his hands, pointing at numbers on a sheet, nodding when the investors smiled. I had seen that expression before, not on his face, but on mine. The hunger to achieve, to climb, to prove yourself. But while I once chased those dreams to give him a life of dignity, he now chased them to erase me from the very life I had built. I wanted to step inside, to take a chair, to remind them all that the story did not begin with them. That every brick in this house, every thread in that tablecloth, every step my son had taken toward his so-called success was balanced on years of my sweat. But I remained in the corridor, unseen, not because I was weak, but because the truth had been locked away behind their ambition. And what is truth if no one dares to look at it? The longer I stood there, the heavier the weight grew. It was not just rejection, it was erasure, as if my name had been cut out of the story, as if I had never held this family together through storms and debts, as if I had never once been a father. I had become invisible not to strangers, but to my own blood. And there is no pain sharper than that. I could hear the clinking of glasses, the toast to a future they claimed as their own. My son lifted his drink, his voice steady, his tone commanding, and they all followed him. Not one of them knew or cared that the very newspaper he was quoting once carried my name, not his. That long before they sat there with their contracts, my story had already been written. But in that corridor, I was not the man from the newspaper. I was not the builder, the provider, the father. I was nothing. And in their eyes, nothing was all I would ever be. The meeting stretched on, each laugh and each word pounding against me like waves against stone. And though I stood silent, I felt myself drowning in the cruelest truth of all. I had raised a son who could feast at my table while leaving me in the shadows, watching like a ghost who never truly lived. The sound of my son's voice carried differently when he lowered it to a whisper. It was not the booming tone of a man making promises, not the excited pitch of ambition. It was softer, sharper, meant only for the man beside him, and yet it reached me like a blade. "Don't mind him," he murmured, tilting his head slightly in my direction. "He's just an old man. He has nothing to do with this." The words were not loud, but they did not need to be. They pierced through the clatter of glasses and the hum of conversation, finding me in the shadows of the corridor and settling deep in the place where my pride used to live. Just an old man. Nothing to do with this. I had been called many things in my life. Worker, husband, father, even hero once, when the newspaper printed my story years ago. But never had I been reduced to such smallness, such emptiness, by the very person I had lived for. My son had not raised his voice, had not spit the words with anger. He had delivered them quietly, efficiently, like a surgeon cutting away what he no longer needed. The cruelty was not in rage. It was in the calmness with which he erased me. The investor nodded, his eyes flickering briefly toward me. There was no recognition in them. Not yet. Only mild curiosity, the kind you give to a shadow at the edge of the room. My son's words had set the stage. I was background, irrelevant, a relic left too long in the house. And for a moment, I almost believed it myself. The pain was not only in what he said, but in how easily he said it. As if it cost him nothing. As if dismissing his own father was no heavier than brushing dust from a jacket. That was the betrayal. Not rage, not conflict, but indifference. To him, I was not worth defending, not even worth remembering. I leaned against the wall, steadying myself. The laughter around the table drowned out the quiet breaking of my heart, but inside me something cracked. I thought of the nights when he was a boy, when I would sit at his bedside whispering promises of a future where he would never feel small or unwanted. I had spoken those words with hope, with conviction, never imagining that one day he would take that same future and build it by tearing me out of it. The cruelty of dismissal is not in being shouted down, but in being spoken of as though you are already gone. My son had spoken of me as if I were a ghost, haunting the edges of his new life, someone to be tolerated until forgotten completely. And in the quiet of that moment, I realized something bitter. Perhaps, in his eyes, I was already dead. The meeting pressed on, numbers rising and falling in their conversations, toasts lifted, plans laid out like blueprints for a world where I had no place. But the words, "just an old man," clung to me, louder than all of it. They followed me into the silence of my thoughts, repeating like a curse, stripping layer after layer of worth from my soul. I had carried him on my shoulders when his legs were too small to walk. I had stood outside factories, begging for shifts, so he would never go hungry. I had hidden my own pain, my own disappointments, so he could chase dreams without ever feeling the weight of mine. And now, when it was his turn to speak of me, to name me, he reduced it all to this: an old man with nothing to do with it. Those whispers did not fade when the meeting ended. They lived in me, etched deeper than any scar, reminding me that betrayal is not always loud. It often arrives on tiptoe, spoken under the breath of the one you love most.
And in that moment, I knew.
I had not simply lost a seat at the table. I had lost the place I thought I held in his heart. The room roared with laughter, but to me it was nothing more than a hollow echo, each sound striking my chest like the thud of an empty drum. I stood there, invisible, and yet I could feel how my very presence cast a shadow over their joy. I was not a guest, not even an observer. I was a burden, a weight they tolerated out of politeness, the ghost of an obligation they wished would fade away. Every laugh, every toast, every careless word about futures and fortunes was a reminder of how thoroughly I had been erased. These men knew nothing of me, and worse, they cared nothing. To them I was not a man with a history, with sweat etched into his skin, with stories written in calluses and scars. No, I was simply the old figure standing too long in the hallway, too stubborn to leave, too quiet to interrupt. My years of labor, my nights of sacrifice, my days of hunger endured so my son would never feel it. All of it lay on the floor, trampled under the boots of strangers who walked past without looking down. I listened to the cadence of their voices, the confident rhythm of men who had never felt the weight of true loss. They spoke of profit margins, of expansion, of opportunities, as though life was nothing more than a game of numbers. Not one of them knew the cost of a roof that doesn't leak, the silent prayer whispered over a sick child, the trembling hands counting coins in the dark. They did not hear the echo of my silence because they had never known the music of struggle. And my son, my own flesh and blood, laughed with them. His voice rose above the others, strong, commanding, full of a certainty that might have made me proud in another life. But here, in this moment, it crushed me. He had learned confidence, yes, but without gratitude. He had learned ambition, but forgotten its source. He sat there, radiant, basking in the approval of men who barely knew his name, while his own father withered in the shadows. My silence was not chosen. It was forced. Every time I thought to step forward, to speak, to remind them that I was not a ghost, but a man who had given everything, I felt the weight of his earlier words. Don't come inside. You don't belong here anymore. They pinned me to the wall more effectively than nails. To defy them would not reclaim my dignity. It would shatter it further, reducing me to a beggar for recognition in my own home. The heaviness of it pressed down on me, suffocating until my chest ached with the effort of standing. I felt as though all the years of my life had been poured into a jar and sealed away, hidden where no one could see, no one could care. The silence inside me was not peaceful. It was deafening. A storm of words unsaid, of truths unspoken, of memories that deserved to live but were instead left to die unacknowledged. I watched the men raise their glasses again, celebrating victories not yet won, and for the first time in my life I felt the bitter taste of being unnecessary. I had always believed that work, sacrifice, and love would secure my place in the lives of those I gave them to, but now I stood as proof that even the deepest sacrifices can be forgotten. My hands, once the hands that built, now trembled with uselessness at my sides. The silence was heavy because it was final. It told me I was no longer part of their story, that my name, my blood, my very existence had become an inconvenience in the bright, glittering world my son was desperate to claim. And so I stood there, listening to their laughter, my heart beating like a muted drum, each thud a reminder that I was alive, but no longer seen, alive, but already buried. In the quiet ache of that hallway, my hands slipped into my coat pocket and touched the brittle edge of paper I had carried for years. A newspaper clipping, folded so many times that the creases had become scars across the words. The ink faded into a ghost of its former boldness. My face stared back at me from that fragile square of history, smiling, younger, alive with a fire that once made strangers stop me in the street to shake my hand. I had been a man worth knowing then, a man whose name carried weight, whose work carried honor, a man who mattered. The article had been printed at a time when truth was louder than money, when dignity was celebrated, when sacrifice was recognized. It told the story of what I had built, of how I had turned nothing into something, of how I had fought to give my son a future brighter than mine. For years I had kept that clipping close, not out of pride, but out of reminder. When life became heavy, when I felt invisible even to myself, I would unfold it and remember that once I had been seen. Once I had left a mark. But now, in that house filled with voices that did not know me, that piece of paper felt like nothing more than an artifact of a forgotten life. I held it between my fingers, but instead of strength, it gave me sorrow. The man in the photograph was not the man standing in the cold shadows of the hallway. That man had fire in his eyes. I felt only ash in mine. That man had been respected, admired, spoken of in headlines. I was reduced to whispers of dismissal, stripped of presence by the very son who had once been the reason for every sacrifice. I wondered if my son even remembered it, if he had ever read those words written about me, if he had ever understood what they meant. Or perhaps he had read them and chosen to forget, burying my legacy beneath the weight of his ambition. Maybe he carried shame at the thought that his achievements were not born from nothing, but from years of labor by the father he now pretended was irrelevant. Memories rose inside me like a flood, each one heavier than the last. I remembered the day the article was printed, how he had been just a boy then, wide-eyed and proud. He had run through the house waving the paper, pointing at my picture, shouting, "That's my dad!" His voice had been filled with awe, as though he believed I could do anything. That sound had been more valuable to me than any award. That moment had carried me through nights when exhaustion threatened to crush me. And yet now that same boy, grown into a man, hardened by greed, sat at a table and told others I was just an old man who didn't matter. The memory of his young pride burned against the reality of his present shame, and the weight of it nearly broke me. I realized then that betrayal is not only about what someone does to you, it is about what they take away. My son had not only taken away my place in his life, he had taken away the purity of that memory, staining it with the knowledge of what came after. The clipping trembled in my hand. For a moment I considered unfolding it, walking into that room, slamming it onto the table and forcing them all to read what I once was. Forcing them to see the truth carved in ink, to remember that this old man they dismissed had once carried the strength of a nation's respect. But I knew it would not matter. To them, the present was all that counted, and in their present, I was already erased. So I slid the paper back into my pocket, feeling it crumple as though it too had grown tired of being held onto. Its weight was no longer one of pride, but of sorrow, the reminder not of who I was, but of how far I had fallen in the eyes of the one person whose recognition mattered most. The memories pressed down on me until I felt smaller than ever. Not because the world had forgotten me, it always forgets in time, but because my son had, and the truth I carried in ink, in scars, in sleepless nights, seemed powerless against the silence of his betrayal. And so I stood there, my legacy folded into my pocket, unseen and unwanted, like the man himself. The words did not come from my son this time. They came from one of the young men seated at his table, his suit crisp, his voice sharp with arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, smirking as he spoke, and though he never looked directly at me, his words cut across the room like a whip meant for my skin. The older generation doesn't understand how business works. Better to let them sit aside. The laughter that followed was immediate and cruel, spilling across the table like spilled wine, staining everything it touched. It was not laughter born from humor. It was laughter meant to wound, meant to diminish. And my son did not stop it. He did not flinch. He did not defend me. He let it ring out, let it wash over the room, let it stamp the seal of my exile onto the very air I breathed. I had known mockery before. I had been called names when I was poor, when my clothes were patched and my hands cracked from labor. I had been laughed at by men who thought themselves superior because their shoes were polished and mine were covered in dust. But this was different. This was not the laughter of strangers. This was laughter shared in my son's presence, sanctioned by his silence. That silence was the cruelest agreement of all. My age. That was what they mocked, as though the years of my life were a weakness instead of proof of endurance. They did not see the nights I had worked until my body screamed, the storms I had stood against to keep a roof above my child's head, the countless mornings I rose before dawn to fight battles they would never even know existed. They looked at me and saw only the gray in my hair, the slow bend in my back, the quiet way I stood apart. They saw age, and they mistook it for irrelevance. Inside me, memories rose like fire. I remembered when my son was small, when he would watch me work with wide eyes, asking questions about everything I touched. He once believed I could fix anything, build anything, survive anything. To him, I was not old then. I was endless. But now, as he sat at that table, basking in the approval of younger men, he allowed them to measure me by the years in my bones, instead of the sacrifices written on my soul. The sound of their laughter grew louder in my mind than it was in the room. It echoed through the years, shaking loose every fear I had ever buried, that one day all I had given would be forgotten, and I would be left behind. Age is not cruel on its own. It becomes cruel when those you love use it as a weapon against you, when they look at the lines on your face and see only obsolescence instead of a map of survival. I wanted to step forward, to tell them that age is not weakness, that it is proof that I endured storms they had never faced, that every line on my face was carved by nights spent keeping someone else safe. But I didn't. My silence was heavy, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew it would fall into deaf ears. Their world was too loud with their own importance to hear the quiet truth of mine. The laughter eventually died down, replaced by the clinking of glasses and the shuffle of papers. To them, the insult was nothing more than a passing remark, a careless jest tossed into the air. But to me, it lingered, heavier than stone. It wasn't just about being mocked for my age. It was about being dismissed, stripped of worth, discarded as if time itself had erased the man I once was. And in that moment I understood something bitter. It wasn't the years that weighed me down. It was the betrayal of seeing those years used against me. My son had allowed them to laugh, and in doing so he had laughed with them. That was the final cruelty. Not their words, but his silence. So I stood in the shadows, carrying the weight of both time and betrayal while their voices moved on without me. My life, my sacrifices, my love, all of it mocked away, sealed with the laughter of men who thought they were the future, and the silence of the son who had already buried my past. The air in the room shifted the moment he entered. It wasn't loud or dramatic, no slammed door, no raised voice, but his presence carried a weight that silenced the chatter like a sudden drop in temperature. The laughter, the careless boasting, the clinking of glasses, all of it faltered as eyes turned toward him. He moved with the calm assurance of a man who knew he was the axis upon which the evening would turn. His steps were measured, his coat draped neatly across his arm, his expression unreadable yet commanding. He did not have to demand attention. It gravitated toward him as naturally as rivers toward the sea. The younger men straightened in their seats. My son was the first to rise, eager to greet him, his smile broad and his voice filled with rehearsed warmth. Chairs scraped against the floor as the others followed, each of them quick to extend a hand, quick to be noticed, quick to serve. They leaned toward him as though proximity itself would grant them favor, their words tumbling over one another in a desperate chorus of flattery. From where I stood, half hidden in the corridor, I watched the room transform. Just moments ago, it had been their kingdom, filled with the confidence of youth, the arrogance of unchecked ambition. Now they were boys again, scrambling for approval, their bravado collapsing under the weight of a man who had nothing left to prove. They offered him drinks, pulled out a chair, gestured toward the papers on the table, as if every number written there had been prepared for his eyes alone. I remained still, a shadow among shadows, as if the darkness itself had claimed me. No one turned toward me. No one thought to introduce me. I was not part of their performance, not a character in their play. I was only the silence at the edge of the stage. My instinct told me to leave quietly before anyone noticed I had lingered. I had already endured enough. My son's dismissal, the cruel laughter of his companions, the cutting whispers that had reduced me to an unwanted presence. Why remain any longer? Why stand there waiting for a moment that would never come? And yet I did not move. Something in me resisted, though I could not name it then. Perhaps it was pride, refusing to let me slink away unseen. Perhaps it was hope, foolish and fragile, that someone, anyone, would look past the table and into the shadows. Or perhaps it was only exhaustion, my legs too heavy to carry me out into the cold again. Whatever it was, it rooted me to that spot, watching as the room bent itself around this single man. The investor lowered himself into the chair they had pulled for him, and the table seemed to rearrange itself in his presence. My son sat closest, leaning in, his voice soft but insistent, his gestures precise, his eyes burning with the kind of hunger that had once made me proud. But pride had long since soured into sorrow. Now I saw only desperation, a need to be recognized, to be validated by a man whose nod carried more weight in his eyes than years of his father's love ever had. The room vibrated with anticipation as they began speaking again, their words careful now, measured, tailored for him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a servile eagerness. Every laugh was shorter, every sentence crafted like an offering, every idea presented as if it were a jewel placed at his feet. And all the while, I stood just outside the light, a figure no one acknowledged. I felt the sting of invisibility like never before. To watch my son fight for recognition, to see him pour his soul into impressing this man, while letting me wither in silence behind the door. It was a cruelty so sharp, it nearly drove me to step away. But I couldn't. My hand gripped the edge of the wall, holding me in place, though I didn't know why. Perhaps part of me sensed what my mind refused to believe, that fate had not yet spoken its last word, that the silence I carried, the shame I endured, the memories pressed into the yellowed newspaper folded in my pocket, all of it would not remain hidden forever. But in that moment I was nothing but a shadow, watching the world turn without me. The investor had arrived, and I was ready to slip into the night unseen. It happened so suddenly I almost doubted it was real. His eyes, which had scanned the table with the detached sharpness of a man who had judged many before, drifted past the eager faces surrounding him. For a brief moment they wandered toward the hallway, toward the shadows where I stood, a figure no one else acknowledged. And then they stopped. He did not look away, his gaze fixed on me as if I were not merely a shadow, not a passerby, but something that demanded to be seen. His brow furrowed, deepening lines across his forehead, and then his shoulders straightened. It was a small movement, but in that instant the entire room shifted. The air grew heavier, charged with a silence that stretched across the table, silencing every word that had once tumbled so carelessly from their mouths. The young men around him hesitated, their laughter faltering, their smiles stiffening as they noticed the change. My son's voice caught in his throat, the smooth flow of his speech crumbling mid-sentence. He followed the investor's eyes, and for the first time that night, his expression broke. He realized that the attention he had fought for, the approval he had craved, was no longer his. It had been drawn elsewhere, toward me. The weight of that moment pressed against my chest. I did not move, did not breathe, afraid that any gesture might break the spell and return me to invisibility. Yet his eyes did not release me. They studied me with growing intensity, as if searching through memory, trying to match the face before him with a name carved into the past. Around the table, restlessness grew. Papers shifted. Glasses tapped nervously against wood. But no one dared to interrupt. They all felt it, the strange gravity of the moment, the sense that something long buried had just stirred, something none of them could quite explain. And I felt my knees weaken. For so long I had been unseen, dismissed, reduced to whispers and mockery. For so long I had carried the yellowed clipping in my pocket as proof that I had once mattered, though no one cared to remember. And now, in this man's gaze, I saw recognition flicker, fragile, tentative, but undeniable. It was as though a forgotten flame had been struck again in the dark. The silence grew deeper, until the ticking of the old clock in the corner sounded louder than their shallow ambitions. My son's hand twitched against the tablecloth. His mouth opened, but no words came. He looked at me as if I were an unwelcome ghost, as if he had spent years burying a truth that now threatened to claw its way back into the light. The investor leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving mine, and in that gaze I felt a shift I could not yet name. It was not pity, it was not curiosity, it was something heavier, something truer. A recognition not of an old man in a doorway, but of a story that refused to die. For the first time that night, I did not feel like a shadow. I felt like the past had stepped into the present, demanding to be acknowledged. And the room, which just minutes before had been filled with arrogance and laughter, now stood frozen, waiting, because something important, something undeniable had just awoken. The pause that gripped the room felt endless, like the moment before a storm breaks. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. Then the investor's voice cut through the stillness, steady, deliberate, carrying the kind of weight that could not be ignored. I know this man. The words were not shouted, yet they struck the table like thunder. Every eye snapped toward me, as though I had just stepped out of the walls themselves. The young men leaned back in their chairs, caught between disbelief and confusion. Even the air seemed to tighten, waiting for the next sentence. "I've read about him in the newspaper," he continued, his gaze still locked on me. "He is the one who built the foundation you are all sitting on today." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The silence that followed was heavier than the mockery I had endured, heavier than the whispers of dismissal. In that silence, every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night, every scar on my hands rose up and demanded recognition. My son's face drained of color, his lips parting in protest, but no words came. The story he had tried to bury had just clawed its way into the room, alive and undeniable. I felt the room tilt, not with power, but with justice. For years, I had carried the weight of invisibility, folding myself into shadows, clutching a faded clipping in my pocket like a relic of a life no one cared to remember. And now, without me saying a single word, the truth had spoken louder than all their laughter. The truth had been carried on ink, carried on memory, and now carried in the voice of a man they all respected. The young partner who had mocked my age shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier arrogance shriveled in the presence of a history he had not known, a history that suddenly made his laughter sound hollow, small. His eyes flickered down at the table, no longer bold enough to meet mine. Around him, the others sat in uneasy silence, their greed tempered by something far less comfortable: shame. And my son, My son stared at me as if he were seeing me for the first time, and yet wishing he didn't. The mask he had worn all evening cracked, and through it slipped the face of a boy I remembered, the boy who once ran through the house waving that very newspaper, shouting, "That's my dad." But he said nothing now. His pride bound his tongue. He had built his future on the illusion that I was nothing, and in a single sentence, that illusion collapsed. I did not step forward. I did not need to. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to defend myself, no need to remind them of who I was. The investor's words had done what my silence never could. They resurrected me. They pulled me from the shadows and placed me back into the story that was mine from the beginning. The silence stretched on, but it was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of recognition, the silence of men realizing they had laughed too quickly, dismissed too easily, and forgotten too soon. It was the silence of a son who had betrayed his own blood, forced at last to see what he had tried so hard to erase. And as I stood there, unseen no longer, I realized something profound. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the right ear, at the right moment, and then speaks with a voice that no one can deny. My son's face drained of color as though the very blood that had once bound us had abandoned him. The smile he had worn so confidently all evening, a polished mask crafted to impress, to charm, to control, slipped away in an instant. It did not fade gently. It was ripped from him, leaving behind the naked truth he had tried so desperately to hide. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted between the investor and me, searching for refuge, but there was none. The weight of recognition had cornered him, and for the first time he could not command the room. I had seen that look before, long ago, when he was a boy caught in some small lie. But this was no child's mischief exposed. This was pride collapsing beneath the force of undeniable truth. His shame filled the silence, louder than any confession. He shifted in his seat, his shoulders stiff, his breath shallow, as though every pair of eyes at that table had become a mirror reflecting back his betrayal. For so long he had built his image on distance from me, casting me aside as irrelevant, convincing himself and others that he alone had earned his place at the table. But illusions cannot stand when truth walks in the door, and now the truth was alive, sitting in the investor's voice, carried in the memory of that faded newspaper, carried in the walls of the very house he tried to claim as his own. His pride, once towering, now trembled like a structure built on sand. The other men at the table watched him carefully. Their expressions shifted, no longer filled with blind respect. Doubt crept in, the kind of doubt that money and ambition cannot silence. They saw him falter, and in that faltering they glimpsed the cracks in the foundation he had promised them was solid. They realized that the story was larger than him, that he had tried to bury the very roots upon which they now hoped to build. And I watched him with a heart both broken and vindicated. I did not relish his humiliation, but I could not ignore the justice of it. He had sought to erase me, to laugh in my absence, to let others mock my years while he stood silent. But now silence was his enemy. It pressed against him, forced him into the open, left him defenseless before the one thing he could not control, the truth. His eyes met mine for the briefest moment, and in them I saw something I had not expected. Fear. Not the fear of losing money or reputation, but the deeper fear of being seen as he truly was. For years he had built his pride upon my silence, upon the assumption that I would stay hidden, bowed, forgotten. And now, with one sentence, that silence had been shattered. He was left exposed, and there was no laughter to cover him. The fall of pride is never loud. It does not crash like a building collapsing in flame. It withers quietly, leaving a man smaller than he once appeared, leaving him with nothing to stand on but the frailty of his own lies. I saw it happen before me, And though my heart ached as a father, I knew it was necessary. Some lessons cannot be spoken. They must be lived, endured, survived. And so, while the investor's gaze lingered on me with recognition, and the room sat in heavy silence, my son's mask lay shattered at his feet. Pride had abandoned him, and shame had taken its place. The investor's voice carried with it the kind of gravity that silences every excuse before it's spoken. He leaned slightly forward, his hand resting on the table, his gaze steady as stone. "If he is not included," he said, "then neither am I. I do not invest in projects that forget the man who built the foundation." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The room that had once been alive with chatter and laughter now sat paralyzed in stunned quiet. The young men, so quick to mock me minutes before, now shifted uneasily in their seats. Their eyes flickered between the investor and me, their confidence draining as they realized the ground beneath them had shifted. The hierarchy of the evening was shattered. No longer was my son the center of gravity. No longer was ambition their guiding star. The truth had entered, and it was heavier than all their plans combined. My son's face betrayed him. He tried to smile, tried to smooth over the moment with some expression of composure, but the effort only deepened the cracks in his mask. His pride, already faltering, now crumbled into panic. The hands that had so confidently gestured over figures and projections now twitched helplessly against the tablecloth. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but nothing came out. The silence pressed down on him, on all of them, a silence not of dismissal this time, but of judgment. I stood where I had been all along, at the edge of the room, my body heavy with exhaustion and years. Yet for the first time that night, I did not feel invisible. I did not feel like a burden, or a shadow, or a ghost. I felt the weight of truth, truth spoken not by me, but on my behalf. And in that moment, it was stronger than every insult, every whisper, every laugh I had endured. The truth did not need me to defend it. It stood on its own, and it stood for me. Memories surged within me, not as torment this time, but as vindication. The late nights, the bent back, the hunger I had hidden, the sacrifices that had scarred my hands, all of it had led here, not to applause, not to glory, but to this simple recognition that without me, none of what they boasted about could exist. My name, my work, my love had been the silent foundation beneath their arrogance, and now it was named aloud. The investor's words did more than just silence a room. They restored balance. They shifted the weight of the moment from pride to truth, from ambition to gratitude, from my son's false independence to the undeniable fact of inheritance. They reminded everyone, even him, that stories do not begin in the middle. They have roots, and I was the root. My son's eyes flickered toward me again, but now there was no triumph in them, no cold dismissal, only shame, raw and unmasked. He had built his world on the erasure of my name, and in one sentence, that erasure had been undone. The truth had returned, undeniable, immovable, and he had no weapons left to fight it. I did not move forward. I did not speak. I did not need to. The weight of truth was already crushing the lies that had excluded me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no need to beg for a place at the table, because my place had never depended on their permission. It had been mine from the beginning. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until even the ticking clock on the wall seemed hesitant to break it. They all knew it now. My son knew it most of all. He could not undo what had been spoken. He could only live with it. And as I stood there, I realized justice is not always born in anger. Sometimes it comes in a single sentence, carrying the weight of a lifetime. My son's lips parted, desperate to catch the air that had been stolen from him, but no sound followed. His throat strained against the silence, his face contorted as if words might still save him, but they would not come. The illusion he had built, brick by brick, lie by lie, was crumbling faster than he could gather the pieces. He had spent years constructing this fragile empire of self-made pride, an empire that demanded my absence to stand tall. But now the truth had slipped beneath the door like light, and no hand could shut it out. The investor's eyes no longer shone with admiration. They looked at him differently now, not with trust, but with unease, suspicion, and disappointment. They leaned back slightly in their chairs, their bodies speaking the doubt their mouths dared not voice. They had been sold a story of independence, of brilliance untainted by legacy, and suddenly they saw the lie exposed. His brilliance had not been born from nothing. It had been born from me, from years of my unseen labor, from the foundation he had claimed was his own. He tried again to speak, his voice breaking into a stammer before collapsing into silence once more. The stillness of his failure pressed on him heavier than any argument. He could not explain away what everyone in that room now knew. He had dismissed me as irrelevant, but the truth had declared otherwise. And truth does not bargain. It does not bend. It stands firm, even when every excuse collapses. I remained in the shadows, not out of weakness, but out of strength. I did not step forward, did not raise my voice, did not reach into my pocket to pull out the faded clipping that had carried my name all these years. I did not need to. The truth no longer required my defense. It was alive in the air, undeniable, powerful enough to silence ambition itself. And as I watched him, I realized the most painful part. I had once believed he betrayed me because he did not know, because he had forgotten the depth of what I had given. But no, he had always known. He had known enough to hide me, to push me aside, to make sure the story told in those rooms was only his. He had betrayed me not by ignorance, but by choice. And now the mask of that choice was stripped away for all to see. The room remained still, save for the trembling of his hands as he fiddled with papers that no longer mattered. He had been exposed, not as a leader, but as a man willing to erase the very root of his own success. The illusion of control, of dominance, of brilliance, stood shattered before him, and in its place rose the silence of truth, quiet, steady, undeniable. I felt no triumph, only sorrow, for the boy I had raised, the boy who once ran through this very house with pride in his voice, shouting my name as though it were his shield. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who had chosen pride over love, illusion over honesty, and now he was left with nothing but shame. I did not need to speak. My silence was louder than anything I could have said, because the truth had spoken for me, and it was stronger than my voice could ever be. My hands trembled, but not from the frailty they assumed clung to me. The trembling came from the weight of release, from the force of something inside me that had been pressed down for too long. Strength, not weakness, coursed through me. Strength born of endurance, of sacrifice, of truth that could no longer be silenced. I had not asked for recognition. I had not stepped forward to demand a place at their table, or to plead for the dignity they had stripped away. And yet, without my voice, without my effort, it came. Not from the son who bore my name, not from the family who had turned me into a shadow, but from a stranger, a man who owed me nothing, who had no blood ties or memories binding him to me. It was he who saw me, he who remembered, he who spoke aloud the truth that my own flesh had buried. The irony cut deep. Those closest to me had tried to erase me, to push me out of the story as if I had never been there. But it was the outsider, the one they sought to impress, who named me, who gave me back the place they had stolen. Recognition came not from love, but from respect, and perhaps that made it even more powerful, for love can twist, can betray, can blind itself to truth. Respect cannot. Respect looks at the foundation, at the scars, at the work that endures, and calls it what it is. I stood still, yet everything inside me shifted. The shame I had carried, the silence I had mistaken for defeat, the bitterness that had gnawed at me, all of it loosened its grip. I did not feel vindictive, I did not crave their apologies. I felt only the quiet dignity of knowing that the truth had risen, and no laughter, no whisper, no dismissal could bury it again. My son sat there, stripped of pride, unable to meet my eyes. And though part of me ached at the sight, ached for the boy he once was, I did not reach for him. This was not a wound I could mend. This was a wound carved by his own hands, a wound he would carry long after the room emptied. Justice had not humiliated him. It had revealed him. The others avoided my gaze, embarrassed by their own complicity. The investor remained calm, as if he had simply stated a fact, rather than changed the course of the night. And me? I felt the trembling in my hands steady. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel erased. I did not feel unnecessary. I felt present, solid, unshakable. Justice had come, quietly, without anger, without vengeance. It had come in recognition, in memory, in truth spoken aloud. And though it did not heal the years of betrayal, it gave me back something greater than their acceptance. It gave me back myself. I stepped out into the night, the door closing softly behind me. But it no longer felt like a barrier, no longer a sentence of exile. I did not leave as a beggar turned away from his own home, nor as a father stripped of worth. I walked out as a man who had been seen again, whose truth had risen from the silence where others tried to bury it. The air was cold, the ground hard beneath my feet, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. I did not glance back at the window glowing with light and voices. That world was no longer mine to reclaim. I had no desire to stand in that room again, among men who measured worth by contracts and profits, who mistook age for weakness and silence for irrelevance. What mattered had already happened. Recognition had been spoken. The lie had been undone. The foundation they sat upon had been named, and no one, not even my son, could erase it again. As I walked down the path I had once shoveled clear for his small boots in winter, memories swarmed me. They did not come as wounds anymore, but as reminders. Every sacrifice, every scar, every sleepless night, they rose within me not as burdens, but as proof. Proof that I had lived not in vain, proof that my life was written in more than paper or stone. It was written in the walls of that house, in the wood of that table, in the very man who now tried to deny it, but could never truly escape it. I touched the newspaper clipping still folded in my pocket, its edges soft with time. I no longer clung to it as a desperate relic of my worth. Tonight it had become something different. It was not a defense. It was a reminder that truth does not fade. Ink may blur, paper may yellow, but the story remains. And now that story had spoken for me when I no longer could. The betrayal of my son still cut deep. It always would. Blood has a way of cutting sharper than any stranger ever could. But even as sorrow pressed against me, I felt a strength rise above it. My son's silence could wound me, but it could not erase me. His dismissal could shame me, but it could not undo what I had built. Betrayal and denial are powerful, but not stronger than memory. And memory was now my ally. I walked further into the night, the cold wind brushing my face. The road stretched out, empty, quiet, but I did not feel alone. Somewhere behind me, in that house heavy with ambition and shame, my name had been spoken. It would linger there, not as a whisper, but as an unshakable truth. They could try to bury it again, cover it with new deals and louder laughter, but the weight of that recognition would remain. I was no longer the man left outside the door. I was no longer the shadow in the hallway. I was no longer invisible. I was the man whose story had survived dismissal, whose sacrifices had been carved into the bones of that family, whether they chose to see it or not. I was the foundation, and though foundations are often forgotten, They are never erased. Justice had not come in thunder or vengeance. It had not demanded tears or apologies. It had come in something greater: memory. Memory that even time, even betrayal, even silence could not destroy. And as I disappeared into the night, I carried no bitterness with me. Only the quiet strength of knowing that the legacy I had left behind spoke for itself, louder than pride, stronger than betrayal, and far longer than their laughter would ever last.